All right, so week 3 of module 4. So going into this was a very long week, and it covered a whole range of content. So the first video that I watched was a lecture given by Dr. Davies, and he talked about opposing ways of viewing our history, of human history. So on the one hand, probably the most popular method subscribed to by pretty much all of us is viewing history as a series of great men. You look back on history and you think of political leaders, you think of kings, you think of emperors. When you think of ancient dynasties, or for example, whenever you think of ancient Egypt, you think of it in terms of the dynasties of the political leaders. Or similarly, you think about certain times in England's history as the rule of, for example, Queen Elizabeth or Queen Victoria. We think of history in terms of the political leader, or a lot of times even the military leader. Like, for example, Genghis Khan or Adolf Hitler, both pretty important military leaders in human history. But so Dr. Davies, he lays it out for us. He says that, well, for starters, he says it seems to be the case that the more people that you kill, the more books will be written about you for history. And unfortunately, that seems to be the case. There's sure a lot of books written about Adolf Hitler, for example. He did a lot of evil, and it's, on the one hand, obviously you need to know about what he did and why that's important, but people who look at history this way are often forgetting the flip side of it, the peaceful side, the side that makes our existence today in the modern civilized world possible. So, for example, he laid out a list of maybe a dozen or so dates, not a dozen, maybe like 10. And so he asked us, what are these dates? And to be fair, I couldn't really name anything that had happened on these dates. But then he goes through it, and he starts. So, for example, 1858, telegraph. The telegraph cable is laid between North America and Europe. This is absolutely huge because now you can talk instantly across the entire ocean from continent to continent. It's a process that makes our world a whole lot smaller, and it's really impossible to picture the modern world, our world today, without cell phones. I mean, but especially just a telephone line in between continents. And then if you go down the line, the radio, Model T, the Panama Canal, all this stuff, all these inventions really shape our modern world a lot more than political leaders or military leaders could have ever have hoped to do. And we're not really taught this. We don't really remember it. I mean, is it our fault or not? Is that our education system problem? It's probably both us and or at least it's our fault if we don't know these dates. If you know these dates, then good for you. I sure didn't. So this is only the first video. Moving past this, we get into a lecture series called Commerce and Culture, given by Paul Cantor. And this covered a whole range of topics, but in general, the gist that he tried to push onto the listener was he tried to dispel the myth of the great person, kind of like the first lecture by Dr. Davies. But in this context, he's talking about culture and the great artist. So with this myth of the great artist, the great lone soul artist, there is a genius out there who has inspiration tucked away in his heart, and he just needs to be set loose on that canvas or on that piece of paper, and he can let beauty fly. And anyone that gets in his way is subverting just true art. And he talks about how widespread this myth is, and I mean, also to this, I also fell prey to this myth to a certain extent. But he talks about how art and culture, just like real life, is messy. It's not just one one contributor to each piece of art. A lot of times you have multiple different inputs from different people. So, for example, he talked about excuse me, Casablanca. I couldn't think of the name. So Casablanca, it had multiple different inputs by multiple different peoples. Halfway through the filming of the darn thing, they didn't even have an ending planned. But when it comes down to it, and they finish the whole product and they ship it out, it ends up today being either number one or number two on Hollywood's greatest films of all time. But if you were looking from the outside looking in during the filming of this thing, you would say it has no direction. It has dozens of different people working on it from this angle, dozen from this angle. I mean, you need someone to lay down a course. You need to have a central planner to guide it in the right direction. But as it turns out, culture, much like the economy, doesn't need a central planner. It's messy, and it's worked on from 1,000 different angles, and you can't really try to control it. So I did enjoy learning about. I'm a terrible culture critic. I'm not very cultured. I'll admit that. I listen to music, but that's about it. I don't know a whole lot of movies, so I really enjoyed listening to these lectures. He knows his culture a lot, not only just classical music, but also up to TV shows like The Simpsons. I enjoy The Simpsons, so I was with him on that. So yeah, I was, as far as viewing the market as not, so another thing he tried to get across in this series of lectures, the market is not some corrupting influence on the soul, the heart and the soul of the great artist. The market oftentimes it lets all sorts of artists get their work out there. And as it turns out, you have kind of like a pyramid. So at the bottom you have a lot of garbage movies. And he explained this. It's not only the 20th century that has a load of garbage movies. If you go back maybe and you look at ancient Greece, you're going to find a load of garbage plays. But as it turns out, the ones that survive today are good, probably because they were reproduced so much that it is their copies that exist. And also for novels during the 1800s, there was a lot of garbage novels. I think he said that he read one and it was just awful. Like it wasn't coherent as a story at all. But the point I'm trying to make here, and the point that that Mr. Cantor was trying to get in with these lectures, is that with the market, you get all kinds of culture, kind of like a pyramid. You have those few gems that are simply just brilliant works of art. And under that, you get slightly less great works of art on down the line. But the point with the market is it allows it all to flourish. You need the freedom. Artists need the freedom to express whatever it is that they are feeling. And the market makes it possible. And the pop culture, they consume it, they take it in, and they vote with their dollars about what they like more. And he was talking he was talking down about how bureaucracies as a method of control, or about allowing culture to express itself. You can't have bureaucracies give funding to certain artists, for example, because bureaucracies are so behind the curve. Like, for example, in World War II, he said Britain was determined not to send all of its great artists out to war to go die, like what had happened in the First World War. And so what their bureaucracy did was they made a list of all of their important artists that would, I guess, be exempt from military service. And as it turns out, if you go back and look at this list, you don't recognize a single name today. And so the point with this example was the government cannot tell what will be popular in culture. It is just, if you want he said he had a lot more faith using the market as opposed to some government bureaucracy with all the bureaucrats just pushing pencils and paper, and I agree with him on that one at least. So did this content change the way I think of the world? So I mentioned earlier that I listen to a lot of music, so I enjoy heavy metal, and I know it's very popular in the community of heavy metal. A lot of times they talk smack about Metallica. So Metallica, probably the most well-known metal band out there, and this is largely due to the fact that they released their Black Album in the early '90s, and this Black Album simply it's a work of art. I mean, there's no way of getting around that. There's a lot of elitists in the metal community that they basically disown Metallica. They call them sellouts, and they say a lot of bad words to them. But the point of it is that without Metallica, there's a lot of people that aren't getting into metal in the first place, because you need that, because they're drawn to the Black Album at first, for example, and then they listen to that, they like it, and then they start going back and listening to some of the more heavier bands. So in a way, I think people generally miss the importance of Metallica in metal, and these people also forget that Metallica released some pretty awesome albums back in the '80s, even if you don't like their more rock stuff from the '90s. So that's just a personal observation I've made from my own experience with culture. So, but I will admit that in the past, maybe up until a few years ago, I had viewed selling out, and perhaps to a certain extent I maybe even still do, because there's a lot of, maybe bands out there, video games or whatever, movies that try to dumb down, I guess they're maybe not dumb down, maybe more appealing for the masses. And a lot of times they're older fans from whenever these bands or these video games or whatever were more niche like. The fans of their older stuff, they don't like it so much whenever they grow more accessible for a wider market. But I think it's also important to realize that their selling out is basically them appealing to a wider range of people. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It means more people enjoy their music. And so that's something that I kind of had to learn, not just with these lectures, but over the last few years, about just our culture. People need to see that selling out isn't always a bad thing. I still think it can be, but it's not always. All right. But so this series of lectures, commerce and culture, I thought it was brilliant. I love the way that he knows his culture, and I envy his knowledge in this field. I just wish I had half the knowledge or even a quarter or a fraction of what he knew about just culture in general. I feel so so insufficient listening to him, but I learned a lot. I learned a lot from these lectures for sure, and it was very beneficial for me to listen to these things too. So, right. So that's the end of week 3, my rehash of week 3. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time for week 4.